William Geroux, known as Bill, is an author of 2 nonfiction books, which, by the way, just happen to be available over here. And is working on his 3rd, which will be published in March of next year. He is a former journalist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch and won numerous awards for breaking news coverage, feature writing, and investigative reporting. We need you in Hopewell. He spent most of his time at the Times-Dispatch as a one-person bureau in Norfolk, Virginia Beach, covering Eastern Virginia, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the military, and nautical issues. But he spent 5 years in the late 1980s and early 1990s covering Tri-Cities, including Hopewell. We talked about some of the people he remembers on the city council. I won't name any names, but yeah, right. One of my favorites, Raleigh E. Group. Always appreciate Raleigh. He grew up in Alexandria, graduated from the College of William and Mary, and now lives in Virginia Beach. And it's my pleasure to introduce Bill, and he is going to talk about the Mathews boys. Let's give a hand. I see this one.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back in Hopewell. It's been a while. My name's Bill Geroux, and I want to talk to you today about my book, The Mathews Men. And The Mathews Men is a nonfiction, true adventure story that highlights the sacrifices and the heroics of the U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. And I tell the story through the adventures of some merchant mariners from Mathews County. And some of you may be familiar with Mathews County. It's about an hour and a half east of here. It's kind of an outpost on the Chesapeake Bay, sticks way out into the bay. It's kind of a remote place. There's not a lot of it's a beautiful place, but not a lot of tourist attractions there. It's not on the way to anywhere. And people in Mathews have a saying that one never goes to Mathews unless going to Mathews. So Mathews it's a remote place, but it's not remote in a creepy deliverance type way. It's a friendly place. And when I was there as a reporter, I would sometimes write stories about the seafood industry, and I'd go down into the creeks and coves and interview the fishermen, and we'd have a nice talk, and frequently at the end of the talk, a fisherman would hand me a fish, like a gift fish. He'd say, "Here's a nice flounder I caught this morning." And in Mathews, it's not polite to say no thank you, so I would accept them, and it happened so often that I got to taking a styrofoam cooler into the trunk of my car and a sheaf of newspapers so that I could take the gift fish home. Because you can't just put a gift fish on the floorboard of your car. I did that once and kind of forgot about it for a little while. The whole car was never the same. So Mathews is isolated. And because it's isolated, there's never been a lot of jobs there, never a lot of opportunities. You could fish there, or you could join the Merchant Marine. And ever since Revolutionary times, Mathews has been a cradle for the U.S. Merchant Marine. And the Merchant Marine, as some of you may know, it's not a branch of the military. It's sort of a loosely organized group of civilians who sail cargo ships for profit. You see these big container ships now, like the one that hit the bridge in Baltimore. Those are sailed by merchant mariners. And the Merchant Marine has been around for a very long time, but it's always in time of war in the United States, it becomes a sort of an adjunct to the U.S. military, because somebody has to carry all the military's gear. And the military men and women, they got to get them across the sea to the battlefields. They're still doing it, but they were never more important than they were in World War II. Just because we had so many people fighting overseas, so far away for so long, They needed so much stuff. And the merchant marine and their freighters and tankers were hauling that stuff. Desperately needed stuff, everything you could think of, planes, tanks, ammunition, food, fuel, everything. They were the supply line for the Allies, not just for the US, but for the British, for all the Allies. And because they were the supply line, everywhere they went, they were attacked by German U-boats, German submarines. And the U-boat's primary mission was to sink merchant ships, cargo ships, to disrupt the supply line. They would sink warships when they got a chance, but that wasn't really why they were out there. They were there to destroy merchant ships. And they did. They destroyed hundreds of them. And they attacked the merchant marine and the Mathews Men in the North Atlantic, between here and Europe, in the South Atlantic, off the coast of Brazil, Argentina. They attacked them in the Mediterranean. They attacked them in the Arctic, because in World War II, we were sending convoys across the Arctic to haul supplies to the Soviet Union, which at that time was our kind of very shaky ally in the war against Nazi Germany. And the U-boats also were all along our coastlines, all along the Gulf and the Atlantic coast, very close to shore. They torpedoed ships right at the mouth of the Mississippi River. They sank them off tourist beaches in Virginia Beach, where I live, right where I go swimming. They sank a couple of ships, and particularly off Cape Hatteras. And I was told earlier that 2 Hopewell men lost their lives in the sinking of a merchant ship right off Hatteras. They got so close that one U-boat commander wrote about being on the conning tower of his U-boat at night and seeing the Ferris wheel at Coney Island. A lot of merchant mariners in these sinkings lost their lives. And it got to be so bad that at one point a publisher of Merchant Mariners textbooks hurried into print a skinny little volume called How to Abandon Ship. And it was just like it sounded. It was a step-by-step guide to how not to get killed when your ship was torpedoed. And it had all kinds of advice in any sort of situation you could get yourself into, including how to survive if you were marooned on an island in the Arctic. And it even had a subsection about how to kill and eat polar bears. Now, I know you're all wanting to know this, so I'll tell you a little bit. That this little section says that if this is your aim, you don't shoot a polar bear in the water because he's too heavy. You're not going to be able to haul him out of there. And if you do shoot him and you're ready to eat him, sorry to say you're going to have to eat that polar bear raw, because if you cook a polar bear, he's just too tough. But what it stressed more than anything else is avoid polar bear liver. And I was wondering about this, and somebody told me that polar bear liver is ridiculously rich in some kind of vitamins that can make you sick, or just do you a lot of damage. The merchant mariners were really let down by the United States at the beginning of the war. We weren't really ready. We didn't protect them. We sent them out there a lot of times with no protection at all, just in where the U-boats could just feast on them. And we let them down really again at the end of the war. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. The book has more than 70 photos. And some of these are action shots from the war, from the National Archives and different museums. But a lot of them are just, pictures from steamer trunks in the attics of Mathews County that people gave to me. And I want to show you a couple of pictures now to give you a feel for the story. You can do the next one, Kima. This is the ring. This ring, it's a gold signet ring, and it was owned by a Mathews sea captain named George Dewey Hodges, and it has his initials on it, GDH. And Dewey was wearing, as he was called, was wearing this ring when his little freighter was torpedoed by a U-boat off the coast of Cuba in July 1942. And Dewey and a lot of his men were lost, as they say in Mathews. They weren't killed, at sea, they were lost. But he didn't stay lost for very long, because shortly after the sinking, some Cuban fishermen found this ring and some human remains in the belly of a big shark that they caught. And they took it back to Havana, and everybody in Havana knew Dewey. So some well-intentioned people sent the ring back to Virginia, thinking this would be a comfort to Dewey's family. But unfortunately, that's not the way it worked out. Next one, King. This is Dewey Hodges. And Dewey, to me, represents a lot of the best attributes of the Mathews Mariners. Dewey never got very far in school. He quit school after the 4th grade to go to work for his family, to go fishing. And but through his just hard work and his natural skill and his ability to sail, he grew up sailing, he rose to the top of his profession, which in Mathews, that was what you wanted to aspire to be master of a ship, captain of a ship. Dewey was an outstanding captain. He was a captain of the flagship vessel for the Ford Motor Company, which in those days ran a whole fleet of ships delivering auto parts all over the Americas. But Dewey never forgot where he came from. He never forgot that people in Mathews didn't have a lot of opportunities, and he always went out of his way to get Mathews men on his ship. In the Merchant Marine, the crew can change. You're volunteers. You can choose to go on a ship or not go on a ship. So every voyage, he'd have a few Mathews men with him, and he would recruit them. He'd let them know. He said, "Come with me. Let's help. Get it. It's a good job. It's a good gig. It's one of the few things you could do in Mathews where you could get ahead." And one of the ways he did it was his ship was docked up in Philly a lot of the time, so he would come home to Mathews on weekends, and he would put the word out in Mathews, which was easy to do in a little place like Mathews, that he was looking for somebody, like looking for a deckhand, looking for an engineer. And if somebody was interested in that job, all they had to do was be standing out front of Richardson's drugstore on Mathews Main Street, and Richardson's is still there. It's a restaurant now, but it's still there. Standing there at 1 p.m. on Sunday when Dewey was getting ready to drive, he'd drive back to his ship, and he would stop the car, open the door, pick the guy up, take him up to the ship, sign him aboard. And that was one of the ways in which Mathews men became scattered on ships and oceans all over the world. Another expression in Mathews is that the sun never sets on Mathews men. Next one, please. Dewey was, as the subtitle of the book says, Dewey was one of 7 seafaring brothers. And this is a picture of the 7 Hodges brothers and their formidable father. And in this picture's in the book, but in this picture, Dewey is 3rd from the left on the top row. And he's looking rather, formal in his captain's uniform. But usually he wasn't that kind of guy. He was a sort of a friendly, affable guy who would clap you on the back and ask you how your family was doing. Just a very friendly guy. But there was nothing friendly about his father, this guy, the guy on the top left. And can you grab the next one? This man is Dewey's father, the patriarch of the Hodges family, Captain Jesse Hodges. And Jesse was, everyone in Mathews said he was perhaps the finest mariner in Mathews. But he was also just a stone cold SOB. He didn't suffer fools or anybody else gladly. He was just a tough guy to get along with, very demanding. Captain Jesse had gone to sea at the age of 10. 10. And he had spent pretty much all his life at sea. He would come home only for short periods of time to spend time with his wife, Henrietta, and his family. And when he was home, Captain Jesse was pretty much helpless in all matters relating to land, with one exception. Every time he came home, he seemed to leave Henrietta with another child. And the Hodges had 14 children in all, and the children accumulated so fast that the Hodges eventually ran out of names, and they named their 14th and last child Hilda 14 Hodges. The other brothers are very interesting too, but I'd like to introduce you now to Henrietta, Captain Jesse's wife. And this is Henrietta. She is churning butter here in the company of one of the Hodges' goats. And Henrietta is one of the main characters in my book. And she was not a mariner, but she was the glue that held the Hodges family together. And every merchant mariner's family had somebody like this who knew how to do everything. And Henny, as she was known, not only was in charge of raising this family that Captain Jesse kept adding to and then going to sea, but she was also in charge of managing the Hodges' 60-acre farm in Mathews. And this farm was on a neck of land called Gale's Neck. And if Mathews was an outpost, Gale's Neck was an outpost of an outpost. It had no electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing, no phone, no radio, no nothing. And it was like something from the place from the previous century. And Henny was basically had to ride herd on all of this. And her grandkids and children and everybody she knew came to regard her as superhuman. And one of her grandsons told me that when he was growing up, he honestly believed that he had accidentally lopped off his arm that Henny could fix. But Henny, several times a day, would break down into tears for no apparent reason. She had suffered a lot of sorrow in her life, and unfortunately the U-boat war would provide her with more sorrow. The Mathews, the Hodges were by no means the only Mathews family that had people in the merchant marine. The Callis family of Gwynn's Island, a little island in Mathews, had numerous sea captains. The Hammond family had 3 brothers, 3 sons, all of whom were torpedoed on different ships during the war. Pretty much at the height of World War II, pretty much every family in Mathews either had a family member, a loved one of some kind, or a very close friend on a merchant ship that was out there, sailing against the U-boats. And for that reason, tiny Mathews County, which had a population of about maybe 6,500 at the time, experienced the U-boat war to the absolute fullest. Here's a U-boat. It is plowing through the swells of the North Atlantic, and in the background is an Allied merchant ship. Now, a contest between a U-boat and a merchant ship was really no contest at all. Most of these merchant ships, these freighters and tankers, a lot of them were pretty old, they were slow, they were overloaded in many cases with stuff they were never meant to carry. Again, planes, tanks, and some of the stuff was very volatile. It was TNT, gasoline. Some of these freighters and tankers were just basically floating bombs waiting for some source of ignition. And U-boats were faster than any of the merchant ships, and they were armed to the teeth. They had their signature weapon, of course, torpedoes, and a lot of them had these big, fearsome-looking deck cannons mounted on the foredeck that were powerful enough to sink a ship without the U-boat captain having to waste a precious torpedo. But U-boats were, they have this reputation as U-boats, like the ultimate weapon. But one of the things I try to show in the book is that U-boats really had a lot of vulnerabilities and weaknesses. They weren't really even submarines the way we think of submarines today. They were basically diving vessels. They did everything much better on the surface, but the way they were designed, they could submerge for fairly brief periods of time, either to get in position, unseen for an attack, or to evade their pursuers, the warships that came after them. And all the warships that chased them were faster than they were and better armed than they were. And if a U-boat could be cornered and driven underwater, and the ships knew where it was, and some of you may have seen these Das Boot and some of these U-boat movies. It's a nightmare. The U-boat guys they're trapped in this U-boat under the sea. There's depth charges, these explosive charges exploding all around them. If one of them gets too close, it's going to crack that U-boat right in half underwater, kill everybody on board. So it's the U-boat, the life in a U-boat was awful. The air was foul. The food was bad, turned bad pretty quickly. The U-boat was so crowded, had so little space that the men literally slept on top of torpedoes, which were stored under their bunks. And the U-boat's operating systems were so unforgiving that even the slightest mistake could bring disaster. And I found one instance where an improperly flushed toilet doomed a U-boat. That's what it was like. But U-boats, despite all these weaknesses, they were ship-sinking machines. And if they could be placed in a situation where there were a lot of targets and no defenses, they could do a tremendous amount of damage in a hurry. So they were always looking for the weak point in the Allied supply line where they could concentrate the U-boats and just wipe out ships left and right. And for the early part of World War II, at least when we first joined World War II, the weakest point by far in the Allied supply line was the coastline of the United States. This is a picture of a merchant ship under attack by a U-boat. This is the Thomas McKean is the name of the ship. And this ship has already been torpedoed, and now the U-boat is pounding it, pummeling it with its deck cannon. And this photo was probably taken by a Nazi propaganda photographer. They would sometimes ride on U-boats to record the damage they were doing, for the folks back home in Germany. I want to show you this picture just to give you a sense of what it was like for these merchant mariners, how difficult it was at times to survive a torpedoing. Very often the torpedo would strike in the dead of night with no warning. And a lot of these men that were in the ships, that the ships would, they weren't armored, they would sink very quickly in minutes sometimes. And some of the men never even got out of their quarters. They woke up to this roar, water rushed in, and that was the end. If you did manage to get out onto the deck after you'd been torpedoed, you might find a situation like this. The U-boat might still be attacking, the ship might be on fire, the deck might be listing steeply, so hard to stand up, much less launch a lifeboat. If you did manage to get off the ship and get a lifeboat or raft launched, your problems might just be beginning, because lifeboats in the 1940s are not like lifeboats today, not like you see in Captain Phillips. These boats in the 40s were just basically open boats. And if you were in one, you were exposed to the elements, the rain, the sleet, snow, the cold, the sun, the broiling heat. The lifeboat might or might not have the water and food supplies it was supposed to have. And you might be in that lifeboat for hours or days or weeks or even months. Some lifeboats drifted for thousands of miles with the people in them, just hoping that they would cross paths with a ship that could rescue them, or that the lifeboat would crunch ashore on an island somewhere where they could get help. So it was a very difficult situation. But a lot of mariners were, thousands of mariners were on ships that were sunk. But a lot of those mariners, after they were sunk and dried off and recovered, they would go right back out on another ship and often sail through the same waters that they've been torpedoed in. This particular ship, the Thomas McKean, was the second of 3 ships to be sunk out from under one Mathews sea captain named Mellon Respis. And he did pretty well in the first sinking, did okay in this sinking, but not so well in the third. And this happened again a lot. A lot of these guys were torpedoed multiple times. A side note, this U-boat that sank the Thomas McKean was the U-505. And the U-505 afterwards was captured in a daring escapade by the US Navy, and it was brought to the United States. And today, the U-505 is on display in Chicago at the Museum of Science and Industry. It's in a huge underground chamber at the museum. And you can go down there. I went down and looked at it a few years ago, and you could go down and they would let you kind of crawl through the narrow confines of the U-boat to explore it. When I was there, they even had some retired American submariners who would walk through there with you and show you how, where everything was and how it worked. So it was a very cool experience. One of the most surprising things to me in my research is illustrated by this picture. This is another picture taken by a Nazi propaganda photographer from a U-boat. He shows the men in a lifeboat that the U-boat has just sunk. And very often, after a U-boat sank a ship and the men were, the survivors got away in lifeboats and rafts, the U-boat would surface and approach these men, and very often at gunpoint would start interrogating them. What was the name of your ship? What was it carrying? Where was it going? And once the U-boat commander got the answers to these questions, and these men would often lie to him, but once they got the answers to these questions, a lot of U-boat commanders would just, without a word, just submerge and take off and leave these guys to the mercy of the sea. But I found a number of cases where U-boat commanders just couldn't bring themselves to do that to fellow mariners. They just couldn't bring themselves to just leave guys. So you had U-boat commanders afterwards, after they would interrogate, they wanted the information. They were determined to sink these guys' ships. But once the cargo was lying at the bottom of the ocean, they didn't feel it necessary to do any further harm to these guys. So they'd give them food, they'd give them water, they'd give them directions or the course to the nearest land, and in some cases they even offered to tow them part of the way. One of the Mathews guys was torpedoed, his ship was torpedoed in the Caribbean, and afterwards the U-boat surfaced. He was in a lifeboat, and the U-boat commander said, first of all, he apologized for having sunk their ship, and he gave them food, he offered them medical attention, he gave them cookies, cigarettes, just gave them basically everything he had. And he also gave them a big jug of drinking water. And if you're in a lifeboat, there is nothing more precious than drinking water. And before the U-boat commander handed over this big jug of drinking water to the guys in the lifeboat, he squeezed fresh limes into the water. And it wasn't a fancy restaurant thing. He was doing it because that introduces vitamin C to this water and will protect these guys against scurvy, which is a vitamin deficiency disease, in the event that lifeboat is going to be at sea for a long time. So, and as the U-boat commander was pulling away, he called out to the guys in the lifeboat. He said, "Come see me sometime in Germany when this war is all over." Another U-boat commander astonished the men in a lifeboat by asking them how the Brooklyn Dodgers were doing. The U-boat guy had grown up, I spent some time as a youth in Brooklyn and had been a Dodgers fan. But I don't want to give you the impression that the U-boat war was some kind of chummy, oh, let's be friends type thing. More often than not, it was quite the opposite. And this picture, I think, really demonstrates that. The men on this ship, this raft, this is a raft, not a lifeboat, were the only men who got off alive from an oil tanker called the Muskogee, which was torpedoed by a U-boat in the really deep ocean, hundreds of miles from land. And if you look at this, these men are in a bad way. It's March. The water is there. Again, they're really far from land. The water is freezing cold. It's rough. And if you look at the raft, and all these pictures again are in the book, but if you look at the raft, it's really nothing but some boards nailed to some empty drums to make it float. And it's better than swimming, but it's not going to keep these guys alive for very long under these conditions. And if you look closely at the picture, some of the men seem to already know this. They've already got that 1,000-yard stare. They know they're doomed, and they were. None of these men, after this picture was taken, was ever seen again. The American government didn't even know what happened to the ship. This was before they had EPIRBs and emergency beacons and things like that. And so it just didn't show up where it was supposed to be. And after a while, they said, well, I guess it was sunk by a U-boat. And 33 American ships just disappeared like this during the war, probably sunk in remote stretches of the ocean where the U-boat guys didn't feel any compulsion to let American authorities know they'd done it. They just moved off and went on with their business. As it happened, the fate of the Muskogee did become known in a very unusual way. 40 years later, the son of the Muskogee's captain, who, like everybody else, the captain had been killed, got hold of some declassified Navy documents, and he figured out which U-boat had sunk the Muskogee. And he tracked down the captain of the U-boat, who was a retired businessman, I think in Bremen, in Germany. And he wrote him a letter. He said, I'm not angry that you killed my father. I realize it was an act of war, but I would really like to know what happened. And the U-boat commander wrote him back. Nice long letter. He said, yes, I sank the Muskogee. And we left these men there. He felt terrible about it. He said, we gave them water, we gave them food, but we didn't have room to take them with us. It was in the middle of the ocean. We barely had room in the U-boat for our own guys. And we were, not only that, but we were on our way to our mission in America. So there was really nothing we could do, but I regret it. So the son of the Muskogee's captain didn't stop there. I don't know how he did this before the internet, but he tracked down family members, sometimes very distant family members, of every member of the crew of the Muskogee, and he sent him a copy of the U-boat captain's letter. He said, I just thought you might want to know what happened to your relative, your grandfather or your great uncle or something. And he got several letters back. Most of the people were very grateful letters. He said, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. At least after all these years, we know something. But not everybody responded that way. One of the letters he wrote was to a Mathews family who had lost a man on the Muskogee. And he thought, the son of the captain thought that one of these guys on the raft might be the Mathews Man. So he thought he might have been one of the last survivors. And he wrote a letter and he said, can you confirm that this is your great uncle or whatever? And the family wrote back in a very short note and said, we cannot confirm this, but we do not wish to receive any more information from you. So not everybody wanted to relive the horrors of U-boat war. There are a lot of different types of stories in the book too. There's the story of the lifeboat baby. And this is a baby who was born in a lifeboat at sea in a storm right after the ship was torpedoed off Cape Hatteras. There's a story in the book about a ship's engineer who saved the lives of everybody in his lifeboat by cobbling together odds and ends and building a still that could change salt water to drinkable water. There's also the story about Ernest Hemingway's experience in the U-boat war. And Hemingway at the time living in Cuba, fishing happily in his beloved black-hulled fishing boat, the Pilar. And Hemingway somehow talked American authorities into issuing him a machine gun and some explosive charges and commissioning him to patrol the remote northern coast of Cuba for U-boats. I don't know how he did this, but they went along with it. And Hemingway's plan, if you can call it a plan, was to wait until a U-boat got curious and came close to his fishing boat, pull out the machine gun, sweep the decks, chase all the Germans down the hatch, and then throw the explosive charges in after them and blow up the U-boat. I'll leave that to you to decide how good of a plan you think that was, but as somebody who likes Hemingway, I'm personally happy that he never encountered a U-boat, because at that point he had yet to write The Old Man and the Sea and some of his other great works. And I don't think if he had encountered a U-boat, I'm not sure he would have had that opportunity. He did get a chance, he did learn enough from that experience that he wrote another novel called Islands in the Stream, one of his lesser novels. But in that novel, a very Hemingway-like character hunts U-boats in a fishing boat off the coast of Cuba. There's a lot of stories, but I want to save a little time and maybe for your questions if you have any. But first I want to show you one last slide and tell you a little bit about what happened to the merchant mariners, the U.S. Merchant Marine after the war. This here is a government poster. It says, "You bet I'm going back to sea." And what it's trying to do is encourage these merchant mariners to keep sailing, even though ships are getting sunk left and right, even though they might have been sunk, even though their friends might have died. It says, get back, you bet I'm going back out there. We're not going to quit. But the thing that strikes me about it is if you look at this guy, he's a tough-looking guy for sure, but looks a little sketchy. Maybe not the kind of guy you necessarily want to bring home to dinner. And that's the way the merchant marine was regarded widely during that time. They were regarded, the public sort of thought, yeah, they're drinkers and brawlers and they have stripes and everything, and they weren't anybody's heroes. And so they were left out of the ticker tape parades, they were left out of the GI Bill and all the other veterans benefits until many, many years later when most of them were too old to take much advantage of them. And they were also left out of the history books. So even though they lost thousands of men, and it took a lot of guts to go out on these boats, which really couldn't barely defend themselves, they're not part of the war story, really, of how we won the war. And when I was interviewing some of the Mathews Men, one of these gentlemen told me, he said, maybe when your book comes out, my grandchildren will finally believe I did something worthwhile during the war. And I really hope the book has had that effect on people. That's about all I've got. I don't know if we have time, but if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them either here or afterwards.
How did they finally control the U-boats against these merchant marine ships?
At the beginning of the war, we weren't really ready. We didn't have a lot of ships and planes to use for that. We were using them in battles. And the Navy was very slow to recognize that, doing anything for these would help. But eventually we built enough ships and enough planes that we could run convoys. along our coast. We'd always been running them across the Atlantic, but we didn't have them on the coast. So they started running convoys on the Atlantic and all along our coastline, and that really cut down. The sinkings just dropped suddenly once we, in mid-43, when we developed a convoy system. I mean, it was still dangerous to be out there, and ships were still being sunk, but the convoys really helped a lot. And then some new technology, some anti-submarine technology that we developed further did it. So by the end of the war, the U-boats had gone from being the hunters to the hunted. And it was by the end of the war, it was like a suicide mission to go out in a U-boat.
Did they have sonar at that time?
They did. They had sonar, and so you could find not all the ships were equipped with it. A lot of them, the merchant ships didn't have any, but most of any warship would have some form of sonar. And what also helped was the development of a radar that was powerful enough and small enough that it could be carried in planes. So planes because they could spot U-boats on the surface, because if a U-boat on the surface, you couldn't find it on sonar, and one could be hiding in the fog, but once you had radar, you could find it. And so that really helped a lot. But they also had sonar, but it was really restricted at that point to the warships, and a lot of these merchant ships were sailing without protection from any warships. So a lot of them had no warning that a U-boat was even in the vicinity until the torpedo hit. Who else? Yeah.
How many of the Hodges brothers lived to the end of the war?
2 of them were killed. The others had some hair-raising experiences. One of them went to Russia, and they had a lot of interesting experiences. Not all the Hodges brothers sailed against the Nazis. A couple of them, after the other brothers got killed, a couple of them, their wives and their families prevailed on them to take jobs, in the bay or somewhere where they wouldn't be in such danger.
This is not a question, but I just want to tell you, I read both of your books a couple years back, and I'm going to tell you something. I really like Mathews Men, but the Ghost Ships was my favorite. And I want you to know that your writing compares with Laura Hildenbrand, who wrote, if you guys don't know, Seabiscuit and Unbroken. And she's also another Virginian. He's a Virginian. And not everybody knows that Laura Hildenbrand is born in Virginia. She's born in Fairfax.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, so I just want to tell you, thank you so much for writing these books, and I look forward to the next book.
Well, thanks a lot. The second book, as you mentioned, is an account of one of these Arctic convoys, an Allied convoy that sailed from Iceland to the Soviet Union in 1942. And so of course, when they got there, the people that survived this convoy got a very disturbing introduction to Joseph Stalin's police state in the Soviet Union, and really a preview of the Cold War.
The writing of that book is absolutely fabulous, because when you're reading it, you are there. You are there with these people, the characters in his book, and experiencing what they're experiencing. It's absolutely fabulous.
So what's the third one about?
It comes out in March, and it's a tale of murder and mayhem out of the vast network of German POW camps that we had in the United States during World War II. A lot of people don't even know we had POW camps, but we had a bunch of them. We had one in Virginia Beach, not far from my house, but we had over 600 German POW camps. We had almost 400,000 captured German soldiers imprisoned here in the U.S. in camps spread out all across the country. And everything was going great until the hardcore Nazis in the camp started murdering their fellow prisoners who were starting to turn away from Nazism.
So did they get sent back after the war?
after the war, we sent all of them back, except the ones that we convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And as soon as we did that, the Germans rounded up a bunch of our guys and sentenced them to death and said, "We'll trade you." So that's what the new book is about.
Wow.
So, anybody else?
Did you grow up in Matthews? Is that how you knew about this particular era and what went on there?
Yeah, it was sort of interesting. You know, at that point, I'd never written a book before. You know, and I was fascinated by the story. I was just fascinated by the fact that U-boats were like right along our shores during World War II. A lot of people don't know that, but they actually sank a couple of ships right at the beach where I go swimming, and it was just I was so amazed by this, and I thought I'd really like to write something about this, but I didn't know how to do it. And one day I was in the library in Norfolk on my lunch hour. I was working for Maersk, the shipping company at that point, and I was looking through an old book about for yachtsmen in the Chesapeake Bay. I don't know why I was looking at that book. I've got a kayak, but there was just a little paragraph in that book that said these yachtsmen were writing, the writers were writing about, you know, how to navigate the bay in a yacht. Like how do you get through this inlet without running aground? Where's a good restaurant, you know, a seaside restaurant with a good wine list, that kind of stuff. But the author put one little line in there and said, you know, while we were in Mathews, we were surprised. A guy at the fish house told us that a bunch of Mathews men were killed by U-boats during the war. And I just went, what? And I just knew in that instance that this was, because I lived in Mathews, I knew what kind of place it was. And just a very close-knit, small, kind of isolated place. And I thought, if there's one place that you can reconstruct a 75-year-old war story that nobody's ever told, it's Mathews. Because everybody in Mathews knows everybody else. A lot of people who grew up in Mathews, are still in Mathews, or they moved away, but they retire and they come back to Mathews. So I started going down to Mathews, while I was working, just on my days off and on weekends, and went to the little museum down there and on Wynn's Island, and just started interviewing people. And everybody I'd interview, I'd finish talking to them. I heard amazing stories. And everybody I talked to, I said, this is an old reporter's trick. You said, you know anybody else that might know anything about this? And they'd say, yeah, go down to the end of the creek here and talk to, Eddie. His father was killed by a U-boat. Or talk to Lucille, she lost 2 brothers or something like that. And there were just more and more stories out of Mathews. And nobody had ever asked anybody about it. All the people were saying, why do you want to hear these stories? Because nobody else had before. So it was, by the end of it, I had more stories than I could put in the book. So it was amazing the way it happened. But it all happened in that moment of standing in that library. And that moment when I saw that, I just felt like I'd been hit by lightning. I thought, this is the way to tell this story from Mathews County. And you could tell there's a lot of little communities on the coast that there's probably some up in Massachusetts you could do the same thing, but I'm not sure too many of them would have the sort of investment in the merchant marine that Mathews County did.
How did your inspiration come for that book she was talking about that's over there?
Oh, I was, when I was working on the Mathews Men, I stumbled across this story about this convoy, PQ-17, that a lot of weird stuff happened to the convoy. And I remember thinking, wow, this is a great story. I got to put this in my book. And I was looking, I kept trying to find a Mathews man that had been on the convoy, because there wasn't any point in writing a lot about it if there were no Mathews men involved. And I did mention it in the thing, but I thought this would be a good story. So after I wrote the book, my editor said, well, what's your next book going to be about? I said, well, I got this story about this convoy in the Arctic. And they said, sold. So that's how that one came about. And then, sorry.
Yes, there was one movie done in 1942 after Casablanca where Humphrey Bogart played in a merchant marine. Do you know anything about
Yes,
that?
it's called, I believe, Action in the North Atlantic. And Humphrey Bogart is the star, and there's a couple, it's been a while since I've seen it, but it's really a pretty good movie, and it gets a lot, a lot of these movies that came out then are sort of like, kind of American propaganda, but this one I thought that movie got a lot right about the merchant marine and the U-boat war. So it's really a pretty good movie.
Also, did the mother and the baby survive the picture?
They did.
Yeah.
They did. They made it back, and they landed, and the father was a diplomat. They were from Yugoslavia, and they'd been chased out of there of course by the Nazis, and been fleeing, and the father was already in America. He was like in the government in exile in New York, and so later on the pregnant mother and her little, well, you can see the picture now, but she had like a 3 or 4 year old daughter that was with her too. So these people were all in this lifeboat. And I've got an account of what it was like in that lifeboat, and how not in great detail, but in enough about what how you give birth in a lifeboat in a storm. But
There was one other movie called Lifeboat, I believe, where
Yeah.
Tallulah Bankhead
Yep.
starred in which they showed a merchant ship was sunk by a submarine, and they saw people surviving in that lifeboat. Do you know that movie?
I do, and there's if I remember correctly, there's a German in the lifeboat too. And there's the movie is it's a sort of a study about human nature, where the people in the lifeboat, and a lot of times you're in a lifeboat, that's a tough situation. People in the lifeboat don't always agree on what should be done next, or how much water everybody should have. So lifeboat is really a kind of a petri dish where you can get a lot of conflict going in there. And that movie characterizes that very well. But yeah, that's a good show. It was on the other night, I think. Certainly.
I've got a question I need to ask, and this may disturb some people, but when a convoy was attacked, ships were sunk, and men went into the lifeboats in the water, were the other merchant ships going to try to rescue them, or were they going to continue on course and go by?
That's a good question. I don't know if you call here. He asked well, I'll tell you if you're in a convoy, a group of ships, and one of the ships is torpedoed and sunk, and the men are jumping into the cold water, and they're it's pretty horrible. The other ships cannot stop for them, because if you stop, you're going to be the next one torpedoed. So there are many accounts of men that were in convoys that were, that the ship next to them was torpedoed, and they had to go by and watch these poor men drowning, or in the water, pleading with them for help, but they just went right on going because there wasn't anything else to do.
What was the name of that second movie you,
Lifeboat.
Lifeboat, I think?
And it has Tallulah, it's an old movie, and it has Tallulah Bankhead and a couple of other stars. I don't remember the others, but it's a pretty good movie. But I think North Atlantic is probably my favorite movie. There's a new thing out on some Norwegian. The Norwegians have had some movies. They had a series about it called War Sailor that came out that was pretty good.
I think Walter Slazak played the German captain.
Okay. Yeah, and he was a bad guy, as I recall, but as you might expect. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your time.